Welcome back, everyone, to the gallery. Super exciting episode this week with Elliott Parker. He is one of the. Are you partner at High Alpha? What's the title that you like to use?
I'm the CEO of High Alpha Innovation. I'll explain what the
Okay,
difference
so there's.
is High Alpha Innovation. Yeah.
All right, so we're definitely going to start by digging into the difference between the two. If you're in the studio world or even somewhat in the studio world, you definitely know about High Alpha in some capacity. We probably don't know about the inner workings. And so today we're going to really peel back the layers, dig deep into, well, what is High Alpha versus High Alpha Innovation, but more importantly, how do they work with corporates? And that means a lot of things. So, Elliott, thanks so much for being here. Really great to finally sit down. We probably met at this point like 6-7 years ago now. Back in the day, it seems like. And really would love to just start off. How did you find yourself at High Alpha in the first place, and where are you at today?
Well, High Alpha was founded by some friends of mine. I was back in 2015. High Alpha began as a studio plus a fund. We started calling that a venture fund, a venture studio. They had four founders of High Alpha had started and sold most recently, before the launch of High Alpha, a company called Exact Target that was sold to Salesforce back in 2014 at a really good outcome. And they wanted to go build more startups like that. Launched High Alpha as a way to do that, recruited people who were good at the early stage of venture creation. Investors suggested a fund alongside the studio would be a great idea. And so High Alpha was born as a studio plus a fund to go launch companies and invest in those companies and other startups with a focus on B2B SaaS, based in Indianapolis, Indiana. At the time when they started High Alpha, I was living in Boston, working at a consulting firm founded by Clayton Christensen, where we'd go, who's the father of innovation theory. We would go work with Fortune 500 companies and try and help them overcome the innovator's dilemma, figure out how do you actually grow and transform these big behemoth organizations. And it turns out that's a really hard thing to do. And a lot of what we recommended, we were trying all sorts of things, but true transformation inside a big company is really hard. And I had this idea around 2017 or so that maybe what we could do is go launch a fund. In my background, had worked on raising a fund before and had been an entrepreneur. I thought, let's go raise a fund. We will use that capital to invest in startups that directly address the problems these corporations have. And if we can't find them, we'll go start them from scratch. And as I was starting to shop that idea around, ran into my old friends at High Alpha who were just embarking on their second fund at the time. So I joined them in 2018, just as we were launching Fund 2 at High Alpha. Fund 1, I think it was 12 companies launched out of Fund 1. Fund 2 in the studio, something like 17 companies. I might be off by a bit. But the last company we launched was called High Alpha Innovation. Which we spun out of High Alpha Studio as an independent company to take that playbook we had developed for systematic startup creation and to make it accessible to corporations as a way to enable them to access innovation that would otherwise be hard. For us, as a way to go start more companies. My view with studios is, in venture capital, you see power law returns at work, meaning you need a pretty broad and diversified portfolio to achieve above average returns. And in a studio at scale, maybe you can launch 4 to 5 companies a year. You can bend the power law curve, certainly in a studio, and I think we've done that at High Alpha. But still, the numbers are stacked against you. And so one of the things we wanted to figure out in launching High Alpha Innovation is what does it look like to scale a studio? And that means partnering with others, getting better access to more ideas, access to more capital. And we decided to use corporations who are reaching out to us and wanting to partner to work with corporations as a way for us to go do that. We thought we could do two important things at once. We could enable these large corporations to innovate in meaningful ways. We need them to do that. Corporations play a really important role in solving big problems. And then secondly, we could build startups and more of them that were more likely to succeed because of their affiliation with the corporations who would come in as a first customer, distribution partner, or other source of credibility for these early startups.
So I got to ask really the kickoff question here is like, well, how do you find corporates? But I'll make it a little bit more interesting and deep than that. I think we look around the startup studio landscape globally, And there was definitely a boom of this probably right around like 2020 through 2022, where it seemed like every new studio that was popping up was basically putting on their website and their thesis, like, we're going to go help corporates build impactful ventures. I even worked on quite a few at the time. And then you get into it and you realize, well, we're probably not going to close our first deal for like 19 and a half months. And somehow we have to keep the lights on in the meantime. And it's really damn hard to do this. And then once you get actually to the table of like, well, what's the deal going to look like? A whole nother can of worms is opened. So it sounded like in your guys' case, it was more that the corporates were already in your back pocket. They already knew you had already been working with them for a while. Do you think there's a recipe there worth following? Or do you have a different set of advice on, well, how do you get started in finding like your first corporate as a new studio?
Yeah, such a good question. Yeah, initially what happened at High Alpha is we did have corporations start reaching out to us saying, hey, y'all are launching companies regularly. Can we learn from your process? And so we started experimenting with ways just like teach others, here's what we're doing. The first company we partnered with to launch a startup was Cummins Engines, launched a company called Anvil, later partnered with Silicon Valley Bank, launched a company called Bolster, and decided there was enough of an opportunity there. We had more corporations certainly reaching out to us and experimenting with this, wanting to experiment with us. We decided there's enough opportunity to spin out High Alpha Innovation in early 2020. So where did the corporations come from is your first question. Certainly, I think our High Alpha brand and reputation assists with some of that. But to date, it's primarily been through personal networks on top of the brand, reinforced by the brand is what I would say. We've got a team of 40 people now at High Alpha Innovation. Half a dozen of us used to work at that consulting firm with Clay Christensen, have relationships and kind of background, a deep experience in innovation theory, which is embedded in everything we do. We've got a bunch of people who were at Techstars and other organizations leading innovation inside of big companies. So we really have a team, a big team of true experts in this. Working with corporations is not for the faint of heart to go start companies. In fact, it may be the hardest way to go launch startups. And for people who are starting out with studios thinking we will fund our studio by partnering with corporations to build startups, it's like, I don't know. It's like I'm going to open up this little business, and then on the side, I'm going to practice cardiac surgery as a way to fund the business. It's not like there are easier ways. There's got to be easier ways to do it. And the reason I say that is that these corporations are not designed to launch startups, and our team's got a pretty good grounding in the theory behind all of this, what we do. Also, a ton of experience working with these corporate leadership teams in going through exercises like this and trying to push and drive innovation. So it is not an easy thing to do. It requires quite a bit of expertise and a lot of knowledge. We've learned a lot in the last almost 4 years of building with corporations about how to go through the process, how to work with corporations, what are the sales cycles look like, how to structure the deals in a way that makes sense and aligns incentives, what tax considerations and reporting considerations matter when you're working with a public company. I think a lot of studios get into it. It turns out to be much harder than many anticipate.
Yeah. So I'm curious what happens more frequently and where they originate these deals. Is it more now these days? Actually, over the years, even from the start when you guys were getting going, is it more a corporate comes to you and is like, hey, we've heard great things. We want to do X, Y, and Z. Can you show us your ways? And they're kind of like eating out of the palm of your hand. Or is it the other way around more frequently where you identify a corporate that is just ripe for a great opportunity to build startups with? You might know some people there, and then you really have to pitch them on how and why they should do this.
Yeah, it's mostly the former, but it's sometimes the latter. So most of the corporations that come to us are hearing about us or know us personally and are reaching out. And they come in a couple stages. Sometimes it's on one end of the spectrum, it might be, we just need more innovation and we'd like to work together to see what we can learn from your process and apply in the business and along the way launch a startup or two.
sounds like kind of a loaded thing to say. We need more innovation.
That's, believe it or not, it's the reality. You get
Okay.
I think of examples in our past where the board of a company, for example, activist investors might come on a board and push the CEO to say, you've got to be doing more outside your core business. And you need to do it in a way that doesn't impact your profitability in that business. Well, we've created a unique structure for doing that. You can invest in innovation from the balance sheet by setting up external independent entities, fund innovation without negatively impacting profitability. That's a big deal, especially for public companies.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's how many of them come to us. Sometimes, like I said, sometimes just we need innovation help. The other end of the extreme is we built a thing and we think it might be a good candidate for a spin out. Can you work with us to launch this as an independent company? And then we've got everything in between, right? Most common is corporations are coming with, hey, this is a space we're looking at and interested in. Can you help us investigate opportunities? There are really 4 reasons why corporations should build new startups outside the business. Number 1, there's a problem that they have inside their company that they can't find a good solution in the market for, and they're not equipped necessarily strategically or through their capabilities to solve the problem efficiently. We can build a startup to address the problem. Often other people have the same problem. And so you can get the problem solved in the corporation in a way that actually generates value. Second reason is the corporation's customers have a problem that needs to be solved. And if that problem could be solved, those customers would be better customers for the corporation. But that problem might be adjacent to what the corporation wants to do. It might not be aligned with their strategy. Third reason is sometimes there's an opportunity to build something in the ecosystem. Strong corporations exist in strong ecosystems. If this thing existed in the ecosystem, the corporation would be better off. But there has to be a degree of independence. If the corporation were to go do it, nobody else would participate. So a startup can go build that solution in the ecosystem, and everybody in that ecosystem's better off. And then the fourth reason is simply there's a new space, a new thing coming where the corporation feels threatened or sees opportunity, but isn't quite sure what to make of it, and just needs to go learn. And going and building a startup or 2 or 5 or 10 in that space can be a relatively inexpensive way to learn quickly and go run experiments that help the corporation know what to do, build optionality, and learn about that new space.
Let's talk about the deal a little bit, the deals that get crafted. So a corporate says, okay, we want to do innovation, and now it's time to make something happen. What type of initial terms get thrown around first? What's the starting point here?
Yeah, so generally our model is one in which we try to align the incentives really carefully. Our business model works when we launch high quality startups in which we have an equity stake. Within High Alpha Innovation, all of our team participates in the outcome of those companies that we build. So we are entirely aligned around building high quality startups in which we have a stake. The more companies we launch, the better. We've launched 20 companies in the last 2.5 years with corporations and universities. Our goal is to launch another 20 companies next year. So everything is aligned around getting to launched companies, which we have an equity stake. The upfront piece, the work we do with corporations, we do for a fee, but we try to keep that fee relatively low. As close to break even as we can get it, because we don't want those fees to be a barrier to launching more businesses. So we go through a cycle where there might be 3 to 4 months of investigation of ideas, getting ideas teed up for a launch decision. That work, the corporation pays our team to do. Effectively, they rent out our team of experts to go do that. Once we get to a launch decision and decide to launch a business or 2, from that point on, we don't get paid. We are a participant. We're a co-founder in the business that ends up coming out of that process. So that's at a high level the model. That everything's aligned around those long-term incentives of building impactful businesses in which the corporation and High Alpha Innovation are joint owners along with the founding teams that we recruit.
Do you find yourself when you're working with a new corporate, first of all, who at the corporate are you actually dealing with? Is the CEO? Is it the board? Is it the chief innovation officer? I mean, who's actually getting their hands dirty here?
All of the above. Yeah, it depends on the corporation, how they do things. We're very often working with an innovation team, a corporate ventures team, sometimes the corporate venture capital team, sometimes the strategy, head of strategy, and then sometimes the CEO, CFO, and board.
Yeah. And are they, I assume then if you're dealing with like the CVC, for example, they know what's going on when you're talking about equity and how the founders need to have the right alignment and incentives. And this isn't like a foreign world to them, right? Or do you ever find yourself like having to educate them almost like the 101 on startup life?
We do actually spend a lot of time explaining why corporations should want to build external startups, number one. And number two, external startups in which they have a minority equity stake, which is really important for making these startups work. And here's the rationale. A lot of the corporations are interested in building new ventures, but the preference is to own a majority or to control those new ventures. And so what we spend a lot of time explaining to the world broadly is that for corporations, the goal of this type of innovation is twofold. It's learning about new opportunities, and it's creating optionality for the future. We tell these corporations the best way to prepare for an uncertain or unknown future, the best way to maximize returns and minimize risk is to go run as many experiments as you can at the lowest possible cost per experiment. Launching an external venture is a very low cost form of experiment relative to what a corporation might do internally. And so if the goal is learning and optionality, the last thing a corporation should want to do is to control that new venture to limit its options strategically or financially. What that means is we want to launch these startups where the corporation can come in as the first investor, often the sole investor at the beginning, but needs to take a minority stake, typically 20 to 30% on the cap table, so that we can recruit world-class founders who are properly incentivized and have a significant stake in that business, so that other investors are going to want to take a look at this thing later, and so that these ventures can go do things that surprise the corporation. If a corporation owns the majority of the venture, guess what? That little startup's going to look a lot like the corporation. They're going to find that the new brand design has to pass through the corporate marketing team for approval. If the corporation owns a majority of the company, similarly, nobody else is ever in the right mind going to invest in that company because there's too much risk. The corporation controls it. So if learning and optionality are the objectives, corporations should own a minority. Not every idea fits that paradigm or that model. In fact, very few of the ideas that we uncover in the course of our work with corporations should be launched as external startups in which the corporation has a minority. But for certain types of really transformative ideas, things that are far from the core business of the corporation, this model works really, really well. And inevitably, those founders go into these ventures with the right incentives, and they do surprise everybody, finding new ways to think about the markets that the corporation never could have uncovered in any other way. So that structure is really, really important. Get the cap table and the incentives right. It matters a lot.
Yeah. So let's talk about then, in my opinion, the most important party in this deal is actually the entrepreneur.
Yeah.
At the end of the day, who's actually building the startup long term. There's so much that has to take place in order to even get to the point of, okay, now let's talk the entrepreneur. But like once you're there, it's a good position to be in. It's already hard enough to get an entrepreneur to join a studio and work with a studio and like structure their cap table a little bit differently than they're used to, or that they've probably seen out in the wild that their friends are telling them about. What's it like when there's a corporate involved? How do you find the right type of founders here? What do those founders look like? And give us the full like rundown on the entrepreneur side of things. I feel like it's got to be a whole different ballgame here.
Yeah, it's interesting. Finding founders for these companies used to be our bottleneck. It's not anymore at all. In fact,
what changed?
I think there are a few things that changed. I think the macro conditions have changed in our favor. It made this a more appealing way to launch a company. You think about what we're offering these founders who come in. You're coming in as the CEO of a new company. We've typically already lined up your first customers. You've got $1 to $2 million on your balance sheet. You're coming in with a pretty good chunk of the equity right out of the gates. And you've got a team of 40 people behind you who are doing a lot of the hard work initially, the stuff that most of our founders in their past companies didn't enjoy doing, we're doing. And then you're getting a ton of support once you launch to help you scale. Yep. It's a pretty appealing proposition. Most of our founders, so macro conditions have changed. It's easier for people to look at this model and say, this is an appealing way to get going. Um,
Yeah.
at a micro level, I think our team we've got a fantastic recruiting team that does a very good job of finding relevant talent for our new businesses. Our typical founder is 45 years old, multiple startups under their belt, exits. They've done this before and view this model as a way to get to bigger outcomes faster than they could on their own. Their best alternative is go
Yeah.
launch this. We work with founders who they could go do this on their own. They could go raise capital on their own to go build a company. This is a way to get there faster.
When you were getting started, early on, High Alpha, I guess V1, how did you guys convince or pitch founders to take a bigger risk, take more of a bet on a less established studio?
It's a good question. I have to talk to some of those founders to see what convinced them to take the leap. But certainly in the beginning, it was a much riskier proposition. The model was more unproven. We didn't have that track record in the studio. Certainly, we were drafting off the track record from that exit of Exact Target and the founders, the operational experience, the founders of High Alpha, which was pretty remarkable and unusual. I think a lot of the early founders wanted to be close to that, but yeah, it was a leap of faith for sure. I think it still is, but it's maybe less so than it once was for founders who come in.
Yeah, I want to shift gears a little bit back to the sort of pitching process. I've noticed in anything somewhat innovative that you do, there's a similar sales process that takes place each time, which is like people get really excited on the other end about this innovative new thing you might be able to offer them. And then you enter into the sales process, and that could be a 3-month sales cycle or a 9-month sales cycle or 2 years or whatever it is. And for the deals that end up getting lost, you start to notice this pattern of like, there's this moment in time, whether it's 10 weeks in or 3 weeks in or 3 days in, or your first meeting or your second meeting where they say something or they ask a question, which helps you realize, oh, you know what? This is not going to be a fit. They are not the right type of partner for us here. I'm curious, have you seen a pattern with these corporates where they either say something or you realize you dig in a bit and there's a structure in place and you're like, this actually isn't going to work. We have to abandon this deal. Something come up there often?
For sure. Yeah. And we have the benefit of the ability to be fairly selective in what partners we choose to work with, which I'm grateful for. For us, what we're looking for in a partner, a corporation that we partner with, we call them partners. We're launching joint ventures effectively together. 3 things that we look for. Number one is clear leadership support at the most senior levels. You've got to have leadership support, as inevitably there are going to be roadblocks getting in the way. This is an unusual motion for a large corporation. This is typically something they haven't done before. So you need senior leadership support. Number 2, you need a clear strategic rationale for why building new ventures is relevant to the future of the organization. And that rationale needs to be understood. That will help remove the roadblocks that come up. Number 3, there needs to be a sense of where the capital is going to come from to invest in the startup that ultimately gets built. And now we've started working with a lot of corporations where those 3 things may not be entirely in place at the beginning. Our team is really good at helping our corporate partners put those things in place, get leadership buy-in, define the strategic rationale, line up the capital over time as we're working together. But if there's not a path to get those things in place, usually there's not going to be an ability to go do this. The second one is the big one, the strategic rationale. Again, back to the earlier conversation, that idea that we're going to go launch external startups in which VCs, founders, others have a stake in those ventures alongside us. And we're not going to control, we're not going to own a majority. I think that takes a certain type of enlightened leader to understand why that is a good way to proceed and to actually take the risk, to take the step to go make it happen. It's a big deal.
Yeah. So the deal's closed. Walk us through the process. What happens next?
Yeah. So
all right, let's build some ventures to now we've got 20 ventures.
Yeah. So it is the way it begins initially. Ultimately, what we want to do, the most efficient way to launch companies is to go build more venture studios with partners. That is our end objective. And so under the High Alpha Innovation umbrella, we've now got a few studios that are up and running or in the process of being launched. where we've partnered, we're the GP managing funds with these partners, and we're building new startups out of the studios. It's a much more efficient way to go. But initially, what we propose is, let's go run a sprint experiment. Let's go build a startup or two and see if we like working together and this is a model you like. Corporations sometimes start off thinking, we just want to learn from you once, then we're going to go do it ourselves. That's fine. We can launch a startup together on the way. That's great. Our goal is to enable these corporations to be independent in venture building, to apply whatever model they think works best for their organization, and to learn from the last 8 years of mistakes that we've made so that they can move faster and don't have to make the same mistakes. So corporation says, yes, let's go. We'll put a team of 4 to 5 people from High Alpha Innovation on that project, that sprint program, full time. And that might be someone to lead the program, an analyst, researcher, someone in the middle, a designer on the team, as well as oversight. Usually 4 to 5 people who are driving the work of initially defining the landscape where we're going to go look for opportunities, coming up with those ideas, usually 200 to 300 business ideas in the first few weeks, going through 8-9 weeks of vetting, going out and doing research with customers in the field to take that list of 200 ideas down to maybe 10 or 20 that seem to have a lot of promise. Along the way, designing business models, hypothesized business models around those, ultimately getting to 5 to 10 ideas that have a ton of promise. We'll select 2 or 3 of those to run through a sprint week at the end of that process, where in the course of 4 days, we'll try and turn that hypothesized business model into a launchable business. Sprint week, we start to then envelop the ideas with a lot more people. So now our in-house legal team, our finance team, our marketing team, our recruiting team, our designers are all getting involved in shaping that business and making it something we can launch with a high degree of conviction. At the end of the sprint week, for us to launch a business, we need to see a few things. We need to ideally have the first $100,000 in revenue lined up for that business, at least line of sight to it. Number 2, we need to believe that business can become $1 billion business over time. Even if it's not entirely clear, there need to be believable pathways to that. Number 3, we need to have a sense that there's a good team here that we can bring in to run the business. We're trying to endow, we talk a lot at High Alpha Innovation about endowing our startups with advantage. We talk about creating advantage startups. And advantage meaning these startups are more likely to succeed than your typical startup in the wild because they've got first customers, they've got adequate capital, they've got the community and High Alpha Innovation that these founders are building alongside. They've got the credibility that from working with us in the corporation. They're getting the coaching from our network and our team, and making sure that these startups are really well positioned to go make big things happen in their markets. So once we decide to launch a business, we then, that process varies. How long does it take to go from a launch decision to actually incorporating the business? Depends on the degree to which that corporation has some of the elements in place to actually make the investment and go. Mm-hmm. But that can be anywhere from a month to 5 months to actually stand up the business, recruit the team, do the incorporation, inject the capital, set up all the payroll and benefits, all those things, get the founders into the business, and then the hard work really begins, which is actually helping that company get going and scale.
Oh, that's when the hard work begins. This wasn't hard work. This wasn't hard work to begin with. Got it. So there was a time, if I recall, where High Alpha had a geographic mandate, right? It was, we built B2B SaaS companies here in the Midwest in the United States. Is that still a big part of the mission? If so, why? And if not, why not anymore?
I think it's still maybe a secondary mission for High Alpha. If you look historically over the last 8 years, the companies launched out of High Alpha, a significant portion of them were launched in the Midwest. And so that's in part mission driven in making the Midwest a more vibrant place to launch businesses. It's also in part because the Midwest is just a really good place to launch startups, it turns out. You can get really high quality talent at relatively low cost. You've got state governments that are very amenable to the formation of new companies and support it. It's a great place to launch. Over time, I think High Alpha has become less geographically focused. You look at where the company's been launched, it's getting broader and broader in terms of dispersion around the U.S. High Alpha Innovation, our approach always since the beginning has been to launch startups where the CEOs want to locate those companies. And so out of the 20 companies we've launched the last while, only a couple of those are based in Indiana. The rest of them are everywhere else.
Sure. Do you work with corporates all over the world or just in a specific area?
So far, it's been exclusively in the U.S., not for a lack of desire, more because of bandwidth. I think over time we are, within the next year or two, certainly we will be launching companies in other geographies.
Yep. Okay. I'd love to get your unfiltered, honest perspective and advice on just the broader world of startup studios. And I think a lot of that includes corporates. A lot of it doesn't. A lot of it includes, VC and accelerators and all that. But studios fit into the mix. I think we'll start from a high level. What was your opinion and perspective in 2018 when you joined High Alpha compared to today? And what's changed?
Yeah. Since 2018, my conviction in the studio model has only grown, but it's grown alongside my realization of how hard this model is to execute well. And I think it's, for people who jump into it, it's much harder than most anticipate. If you look across the studios that have succeeded, look across the broad pool of startup studios, venture studios that have launched in the world over the last, let's say, 10 years. By some counts, over 800 studios around the world now. Power law returns apply to studios. It's a very long tail. When I look at that list of 800 plus studios, most of the studios are going to fail.
Sure.
Very few of them are going to succeed in producing the types of returns that top performing studios do. There are a lot of reasons for that. If you look at what successful studios have in common, they're all doing things a little bit differently, but there are certain elements they all have in common that lead to their success. For example, deep operating experience in the founding team, good network of investors, founders, helpers in the studio operating team. Mm-hmm. Running a fund to deploy capital, having capital ready to deploy in the startups that get launched out of the studio is critical. Very few examples of studios bootstrapping their way to success. Very, very few. And yet that list of 800 plus, most of them are attempting to do that. It doesn't mean it won't work, but the data would say that that's not a path, correlation, causation, who knows? Maybe there'll be more that are successful doing it. But to date, very few successful studios have bootstrapped. Anyway, certain elements that successful studios all have in common. And then on the flip side, there are common failure modes for studios too, why they fail to succeed. The top one is simply that they don't have the capital. The classic case is you get a few entrepreneurial people together and say, we formed a studio, we've got ideas for new businesses, we're going to launch these businesses. And then they're spending all their time fundraising for the startups that they're trying to spin out. And for anybody who's raised capital for a startup, doing it for one startup is will suck the life force out of you. Trying to do it for multiple that way is, I think people underestimate how arduous that task is. The other big failure mode is that just the complexity in a studio. If you are successful in spinning out companies and launching those, the complexity grows exponentially as your portfolio grows, based on what you've promised in terms of the help you're going to provide to these companies. You might, as a studio founder, find that you're spending all your time in board meetings, for example. You don't have time to devote to launching new businesses anymore, and studios kind of collapse on themselves in those instances. So we launched High Alpha Innovation. We were very aware of what leading studios were doing right, as well as what the failure modes, and tried to design with those things in mind so that we had the best chance of success possible.
I feel like over the years, I'm curious your perspective on this, especially with corporates and then outside VCs, but starting with corporates, take the years like 2017, 2018. For reference, I was at Boulder Bits at the time, throwback of a name, and we had just started GSSN. no one in the world knew what a studio was. It was like literally 1% of people in tech knew what it was. And we had to really explain and describe, like, well, this is a startup studio. Here's how it's different from an accelerator. Here's how it's different from a VC fund. We would use accelerators and VCs as like, you know what an accelerator is, right? Well, we're similar to that, but, and then we'd work off of that.
Yeah.
And that's how we would angle the conversation. And to tell you, we spoke with some corporates back then as well, and it was the same type of deal. Fast forward to today, it's been about 5-6 years, and everyone knows what a studio is or claims they know what it is. So you don't have to have that conversation anymore, which is great. It makes the educational chapter of the pitch go away. But then you get into it and you realize, well, they actually don't really know that much about the model. They know from a high level, like, oh yeah, it's a startup it's a fund where you build companies internally. Have you seen over the years your storytelling, pitching, biz dev, and sales cycle change as the world becomes more aware of, just from a high level, what a studio is? And has that hurt you guys or has it helped you guys?
Yeah, such a good question. I think it's gotten harder, actually. And there are a lot of reasons for that. Start with the premise that, first of all, the world needs more entrepreneurs and more of them to succeed in their attempts at entrepreneurship.
I think that's why we all do this at the end of the day. So
full stop.
We always want more entrepreneurs in the world. That's it.
Full stop. For the progress of humanity, the world needs more entrepreneurs to be successful.
Yeah.
There are a lot of ways to start companies. Traditional venture capital model is a way. There fortunately is a flourishing of ways to go build businesses right. I wish there was more experimentation and more attempts by people right now to figure out. I wish there's more room to be creative in approaches for launching businesses. One of the challenges with the studio model is that it's one of those words that means everything and nothing at the same time. And you've now got a lot of people out kind of propagating that term with very different understandings of what the model actually is. And similarly, you get a lot of people who, as a result, have misinformation in their heads about what a studio model is and how it works. We've got stunning examples of success in venture funds that have incubated businesses successfully. So we know the model works. We know we've got stunning examples of success in straight venture studios like High Alpha that have been extraordinarily successful over the last 8 years. But you've also got a lot of people out there in the world who still do not understand. A lot of venture investors, for example, it's interesting. A lot of LPs are confused by the model still. In fact, a lot of LPs are reluctant to invest in venture studios. And when you dig into why, it'll start off with like, well, I don't think the entrepreneurs are properly incentivized, or the cap tables don't work, or we're not sure you can produce enough good ideas out of a studio, which is another way of saying ultimately that studios don't produce the returns that other forms of venture capital or private equity might for an LP. The data shows that is absolutely not true, especially for well-performing studios. Now, when we look across the long tail, most studios are going to end up losing money, just as most venture funds, I think, across the long tail lose money too.
Sure.
How it compares in the end, we'll see. But for top performing venture studios, the returns are outrageously good. For all the reasons you would expect. It's for obvious reasons, right? Venture studios are getting very low cost, high quality equity in these startups at the ground floor. These startups are more likely to succeed and get to good outcomes than a typical startup because of all the help they receive along the way. So from an investment perspective, they're a fantastic opportunity for LPs, but there's a lot of misinformation out there. So it's interesting to have those conversations with investors to dig into, like, well, ultimately it comes down to, I don't believe the returns are as good. And like, well, here's the data. I don't know what
you
to
tell
say. Beyond, I can show you the data. If you don't agree with the data, fine. I'm kind of at a loss for words after that. But the model, when executed well, can produce really good returns. I've gotten more convinced of that over time.
Yeah. Do you think that LPs, I mean, look, it's hard to say about all of them because it's kind of like you talk to one LP, you talk to one LP. But I feel like I've seen a pattern where, especially in just the world of venture capital, people get most excited about the size of the exit. Was this a $5 billion acquisition? Was this a massive IPO? How big was the exit? But what they're not really talking about or paying attention to is how big was the ROI. Because you could sell a company for $100 million that only raised 500K, way bigger ROI than if the company raised $200 million and sold for $1 billion.
Yeah.
Are you finding that LPs get hung up on, well, we need to see more unicorns in this model? Or are they wrapping their heads around the fact that, like, we're seeing lots of studios pop up. They're like, no, we're not going for unicorns. We're going for base hits and doubles. We're going to flip companies at $10 million, $15 million each, but we're going to build them in a year and we're going to invest 500K into it. Huge ROI.
No, I think it's a lack of understanding about how the model works. And to be clear and to be fair, there have been some bad actors out there too. Some examples of teams calling themselves studios and doing things that aren't great for the LPs or the founders. So, but I will tell you, the LPs that we work with are very enthusiastic supporters of the venture studio model because they see the promise and the opportunity. Very enthusiastic.
To the extent you're able to share, can you talk a little bit about your LPs, the types of folks they are, the profile, how you found them? And I'm curious because I've met quite a few studios these days who the GPs are getting going. I'll give like kind of a broad strokes example of what I'm seeing now. And folks that I'm working with, even directly, quite a few. GPs that made a bunch of money for a corporation in their previous life. And now they want to start a studio, and the CEO or like the main investor in that corporation says, I'll be an LP in your studio, or the sole LP in your studio. But you got to be building within this industry, of course. This is our space. And so that's an interesting LP profile where like they understand the space, they can actually be value add. They're not necessarily the partner like a typical corporate partner would be, where seems like you have outside LPs that have no relation to the corporation. In this case, we're seeing it where the corporation is the LP in the fund. I mean, how does that model look and feel in your mind?
So it's a little bit different in High Alpha Studio, High Alpha Innovation, how we think about that for good reason. They're different models, right? A traditional studio operates. Sarah Anderson of Vault's done a great job defining company creation funds, right? So these entities as company creation funds, where you're raising money from LPs, often who are looking at this as an alternative to venture or traditional venture, a way to get access to deal flow, for example. That's a different kind of LP than we might engage in High Alpha Innovation in the studios that we're operating, or in High Alpha Innovation itself as investors we bring into the company. Mm-hmm. Where we've seen a lot of interest is with, in particular, with family offices. When we think about one of the things that's been interesting the last three years running High Alpha Innovation, it's what I have realized is that to pull this off, as our portfolio has grown and as it shows promise of growing pretty rapidly over the next few years, I've realized this is bigger than our team of right now 40 people. If we can take a single portfolio company and we can help that portfolio company go from a $20 million exit to a $100 or $1 billion exit, that produces pretty dramatic returns back to the studio even after dilution. And so we want to be investing as much as we can in that portfolio, enabling the companies we have launched to have a better chance of success, but also in launching more companies. For us, family offices tend to be a really good partner in doing that, because you often have individuals who are really well connected, experienced in their industry, who want to lean in and work with some of these companies. But also for family offices, it's really tough to get high quality deal flow for direct investment in startups. I remember when I was doing corporate venture capital, it was a similar problem. Nobody was going to us as a corporate investor as their plan A. Rare exceptions to that. But usually they'd go pitch to tier one VCs. And if those VCs were saying no, it's like, well, maybe we go get some corporate money. And so as a result, we saw a lot of B plus deals, right? Family offices, it's compounded. It's even harder to get access to the best deals. And so what we're building is really high quality, truly unique deal flow, and work with family offices who participate in these things alongside us. They get the opportunity to double down on the top performers, but they can also lend a hand in this coalition we're building to make sure the portfolio is going to have a better chance of producing good outcomes for everyone.
Love it. We're getting kind of close on time, but I'd love to hear some closing thoughts on essentially the call to action for High Alpha. I know you guys build startups now. You're building studios. You've been around for quite some time, but it actually really does feel like you're just getting started. And I know you guys have big ambitions and vision here. What do you want to? Excuse me, I hit my mic there. If anyone heard a weird sound, I hit my mic. What comes next for High Alpha, and what do you want people to walk away with here?
So for High Alpha Innovation specifically, our goal as we began in the beginning was to figure out what does it look like to scale a studio model. For us, the early beginning, the first year we launched, we were figuring out how to work with corporations. We actually didn't launch any new ventures that first year. It was about learning the process of how do we do this. Our second year, we began launching new companies. And third year, started doing even more of that. This year has been about the transition, continuing to launch businesses, but now also launching studios with partners. The next couple of years for us are going to be about making sure those studios are running really, really well. And that's a model that we can stamp out and do more of. Goal in the next few years is to launch 10 or more studios in total. And we're pretty close to halfway there at the moment.
Yep.
Each of those studios can launch 5 startups a year. Well, we're launching at that point 50 companies a year, and the portfolio grows pretty rapidly. The goal in the next decade is to, unabashedly, we want to build the world's most valuable venture portfolio. And I think we can. We've tripped into this amazing model. It's an incredibly difficult model to execute, but a really good model for building high quality startups that have advantage. And if we can do that at scale, the portfolio grows. And in the end, as we talked about earlier, more entrepreneurs succeeding and helping to drive progress, which is in the end what matters most.
Totally. Awesome, Elliott. Thank you so much. Where can people find you online?
Find me on Twitter. Parker is the best way to do it. On LinkedIn too, Elliott Parker. Website for the High Alpha Innovations, highalphainno.com.
Thank you, my friend. We'll talk soon.
Thanks a bunch.